that we're going to get to here is that America is going in the direction that our founding fathers said. But you know, it's like none of us are perfect, and so we started off with the basic thing about America is that the Creator made all of us, that all of us are created equal and gave us unalienable rights, and yet we don't treat each other that way. And we didn't treat big groups that way, and we've made a lot of improvement, but we still have problems like that in various areas in society, right? This is what America's all about. Ultimately, this is what America's all about. This is what the Constitution is all about. What the Declaration of Independence is all about is equality, equal rights for all Americans. But let's talk about equality. What kind of equality do we believe about America? Do we believe that everybody is equally smart?
No.
Equally rich?
Equal
A lot of people believe that they ought to be equally rich, but we're not. How about equally good looking? Should everybody be the same? So what kind of equality do we believe in here in America?
Equality before the law.
Equality before the law, equal opportunity. That's what we believe in here, and then we're still not there. We're not there, obviously, totally. But that's ultimately what. If you read that Principle 6 there, you would have read about Rousseau at the time when this is going on, and with our founding fathers. Rousseau argued that all men ought to be equal, but that was the French Revolution deal. It was a political kind of a push to try to justify taking from the rich, in fact, chopping off the heads of the aristocracy, right? Because it's the rich. It's because they're rich and they're taking from the poor, and that's what making all the poor people merciful. That was a political argument that was being made, and somehow I don't know enough about to know why a good man like Rousseau, I don't know if he believed that or he got roped into it, but he did argue that everybody ought, and that's the French deal. That's what the French Revolution was based on. Egalite, you know, as well as brotherhood, egalitarianism, and whatever the other thing was that they believed in. Liberty, yeah. Liberty, egalite, liberté, egalite, and brotherhood, fraternity. But they believe that everybody should be equally rich. We don't believe that here in America. Although we're getting there, aren't we?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
the political movement is going in that direction. It is the argument of that particular issue. Indians, Native Americans, they were here first. This was their deal. We call them Native. We don't call them American Indians anymore. They're Native Americans, right? They were here. Let's see. Did I put in here? Yeah, the 1830 Indian Removal Act. Yeah, let's do that and then the treaties, because they happened later. In 1830, Andrew Jackson was the president of the United States. I like Andrew Jackson. In a lot of ways, he was a great president, but he hated Indians. And there's no doubt that he was bigoted against Indians. I think his mother was killed by Indians or something like that. But he was one of those guys that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And he, during his administration, they passed the Indian Removal Act with reservations west of the Mississippi. Tens of thousands of them died. That's why they called it the Trail of Tears. Some of them, Chief Joseph and others, you know, tried to get away and so on. But they forcibly moved them with the Indian Removal Act. Now, we've done them wrong here, but let's keep going with Native Americans. As we moved into those lands, we passed treaties. Now, we've all been looking at the Constitution. It says in the Constitution that this, in a couple of different places, including the Supremacy Clause in Article 6, it says the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, as well as any laws passed by Congress that are constitutional, that obey the Constitution, and any treaties passed by Congress that are and signed by the President that are constitutional. I will just mention, for example, we've signed the UN treaty, but I guarantee you it doesn't obey the Constitution. It genuflects and says that we will get approval from for example, from the United Nations before we will go to war. And by the way, we've kept our promise that. We've not had a legally declared war since we signed the UN Charter in 1946. But I digress here. What I wanted to say was that Congress signed and the President signed 370 treaties with the Indian tribes over a period of years in the 1800s. Does anyone know what happened with those 370 treaties? How much land the Indians got? What got? The answer is that zero, nothing. They got nothing. They did. We just ignored those treaties, and they're the supreme law of the land. I remember talking about this in law school, and the question was, well, what if all of a sudden Texas is a big state. What if all of a sudden we were to obey those 370 Indian treaties and gave them back because we breached the agreement and gave them back lands that they had? We'd have to give them back what's called Aslan and change America, but it's a Indian treaty. Finally had the Indian Citizen Act, and that said that any Indians who were not already, who had not assimilated into society and become citizens, were citizens of the United States if they wanted to be. Their position in the tribe, most of them then became American citizens.
How many treaties did you say that were ignoring?
370.
Okay.
370. It's 370 or 380, and I think it was 370, Bob.
In Southern California, the Mexicans have a better idea. They want California, and in particular, Southern California. The white women, they're averaging 1.3 births per female. And you can go through the races, they differ, but none of them approach the Mexicans over 6. 6 something like 6 point.
Good for them.
Sooner or later, they'll have control of the government.
Well, but that's our theory. I did my part. Trust me.
I don't say there's anything wrong with that, I just say they're smarter.
Back to the 14th Amendment here. Boy, do we want to talk about that right now? Let's do this and so on. 26, keep that on here because I'm usually talking to college kids. Same-sex marriage, Defense of Marriage Act, under bathrooms and other facilities. Hate. Okay, same-sex marriage has been a big исsuue for the last 20 years at least. And Americans are polarized. The law right now is that same-sex marriage, according to just within the last 2 years or 3 years, we've had 2 major decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court outlawing all Defense of Marriage Acts, not on constitutional basis. 8 in California. I got to tell you about that if you don't remember Proposition 8. The California legislature passed a law saying that same-sex marriage was okay there. I think they already had it in Massachusetts and Connecticut, but they did it in California. The trouble was that the polls showed that the great majority, something like over 60% of Californians, believe that marriage should be between a man and a woman. So they have an initiative, a citizens initiative law there. 24 states do. A citizens initiative says that if you can get enough signatures on a ballot, something on the ballot, they can pass a law. And they did that. They proposed a citizens, and it was called Proposition 8. A proposition is an initiative. It's put on the ballot by the citizens. And for 1,000 years, laws passed by citizens, it's like the jury in the criminal justice system. It's the most basic, fundamental, strong form of law. The people themselves say, we're setting the law on this. And so Proposition 8 was hard fought, if any of you were involved in it. The lobbying, the dirty, vulgar, mean, and millions of dollars were spent by Californians and Americans and people from all over the world, because this was the big fight on that. And so they passed the Citizens Initiative. Well, the other side is saying marriage between a man and a woman. And so the other side said, we're not going to let it go at that. We're going to sue in courts. They went to court, and every court. It went to the Ninth Circuit and the U.S. Court of Appeals, which is just below the Supreme Court. Now, everybody knew that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, which is the most liberal one, it's in San Francisco, and they always, one thing I like about them, they do whatever they darn well please. They don't worry about being overturned. They're the most overturned court but they did what everybody expected them to do. They overturned. They supported. I forget what the lower court had done, but they supported the idea that the citizens could not. In fact, they said marriage is so important. It's so important that it's too important to allow the citizens to decide. It ought to be the legislature, and so they didn't form the legislature. But nobody was really worried because it was going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, right? Well, the U.S. Supreme Court chose not to hear the case, even though it was the #1 case in the whole. Now, I realize every year there are about 8,000 cases, and we've talked about this, about 8,000 cases that get appealed to the Supreme Court, and but only about 80 of them get heard. They have a winnowing down process. Only about 80 of them get heard. So you might say, well, only 1% actually get heard, but in this case it was the most important case, and why wasn't it heard? Well, there were political reasons, I'm sure. And it wasn't heard. So what happens when the U.S. Supreme Court refuses to hear a case? What's the result? Yeah, the lower court, whatever the lower, and whatever they said goes. And the lower court was the Ninth District Court, which said, no, citizens should not be able to do this. Marriage Act, Massachusetts, I think they were the first, when they said they were going to allow same-sex marriage and civil unions, all of a sudden, about 40 states, by the way, the Constitution doesn't law. That's one that's clear, and because Article 4 clause in it that says that one state has to give full faith and credit to legal things that happen in another state. You sign a contract, you buy a car, you use it, and they come down to Texas, and then we've got 40 of the states passed these defensive marriage acts. There wouldn't be any argument if they also a national defensive marriage act. This was unconstitutional. The U.S. Supreme Court should have said, good for you, but you can't pass a defensive marriage act. That's left to the states to decide whether they'll have same, and all that stuff is left to the individual states.